So the recording Ricky did for the July 1st balance patch got messed up audibly somehow, so I'll be doing it as a monologue instead. Actually, moving on to the cards, there were quite a few changes, though most of them don't really matter for constructed play, since a lot of the changes were from Ardy being minorly reworked, particularly in the quests, but there were some somewhat impactful nerfs, particularly to EHS and Brothers Reunion. Talking about this first, Brothers Reunion now puts the cards to hand always, instead of ever to play if it was 2 CMC or less. EHS now mills and then chooses 2 of them, 1 goes to hand, 1 goes to the stack, still needs to be 2 mana value or less. These changes are definitely the most important part of the balance patch for anyone kind of doing some deck building. They also impact quite a few decks in the format, since a lot of decks were playing Brothers, Souls, if you want to call them that. So Clerics, Creature Vomit, Hounds as some examples. I'm not inclined to say that Brothers Reunion is still a playable card in the format, particularly because it's so tempo negative in a deck well needing a lot of different creatures to play. So it does impulse draw you too, which is good, that it only impulse draws you creatures, and generally impulse is a card that goes more in decks with non-creatures, which makes drawing creatures a bit annoying. It does also need generally the same amount of creatures that it did before, though they can be higher up in the curve, and that's generally going to be about 24 minimum at least. I think the only place that you probably want Brothers Reunion is if you can play it very naturally and trigger it very naturally. So something that would make 2 tokens is obviously still good with it. You still do have Overgrowth Guardian as a card that works exceptionally well with it. Turn 1 Overgrowth Guardian, turn 2 Brothers Reunion, attack, get 2 triggers. Then on turn 3, since the counters have been buffed to 2 on each creature, you can then attack with Overgrowth Guardian again. That puts 4 counters in total, 4 on body, and Brothers Reunion is an incredible card, but that's unfortunately a bit of a hard scenario to bring up, since, well, you're playing Overgrowth Guardian in a deck that probably doesn't want Overgrowth Guardian too much, and you've also not really done anything on turn 2, which is not great for a deck that probably wants to be more on the aggressive side, since you want to be valuing those counters, but it is reasonable there. That is unfortunately a bit of a niche scenario though. Endless Helpless Souls is still definitely playable, because it only casting 1 and putting it up at hand opens up a lot of possibilities, particularly with counter spells and X spells as good examples. Additionally, milling is also very impactful in a much more direct way, maybe than putting to hand, where you can play stuff like Danuth the Muckbruiser and Niche 2 or other kind of cards that value getting put to Yard. The Spirit Script package is another good example of cards that really like going to Yard. Additionally, just kind of coalesce stuff in general, if you want to mess around with that. Works pretty well, since it just kind of gives you more value. X spells, there's a bunch of good X spells in the format. Not all of them are in EHS and Scholar, but there are a couple like Children of the Clouds that were really bad to cast off EHS, but do have mana value 2 or less. So you can put those into your hand instead, and you're pretty happy about that when you cast them later. The last couple nerfs, / I guess reworks, were to Acorn Assault and Ardy's Invocation, as well as Pensive Songwriter. Acorn Assault no longer untaps lands, now just untaps non-land permanents. That means that the decks that were kind of using it, so Prowess as the key example, doesn't really want it anymore because it doesn't really perform that kind of strong on role. It does still give hexproof, but at the same time, you probably want to be playing Blossoming Defense, since that also gives a toughness boost to deal with sweepers or combat, rather than Acorn Assault. Though Acorn Assault does have some utility in untapping non-land permanents reasonably efficiently, which might have some utility, but I'm not entirely sure what that utility would be. Ardy's Invocation got a full rework, no longer is a ritual in general, which is probably for the better, since Orchestrate rituals are just kind of scary. Now instead makes a 1/1 and gives you a board +1/+1 haste, which is just pretty good in general. Still has Orchestrate red and green, which means that you can Orchestrate turn 2 and try to do some cheeky stuff on turn 3, playing something that makes a bunch of tokens. Then Ardy's Invocation comes off the stack, everything gets +1/+1 haste, you get an additional body. So something very basically you can do is play Orchestrate Ardy's Invocation turn 2, play Creativity on turn 3, Ardy's Invocation comes off the stack, you cast it free, Creativity triggers, get 2 1/1s, then you're attacking for 6, and that's just pretty solid. You can also do kind of more vanilla stuff, where you just Orchestrate Ardy's Invocation, and then play a scary 3-drop, give it haste, deal a good amount of damage. Even something like Rapacious Rattler on turn 3 is pretty scary after Ardy's Invocation. Or you can just play it as a ritual, or not a ritual, sorry, as an anthem in more go-wide style decks. Though there aren't a ton of those in red at the moment. Part of that was that there wasn't any good payoffs, which now Ardy's Invocation is a reasonably good payoff for it. Then we have Pensive Songwriter being changed, so now it exiles the card, and then you can cast it from exile, so it doesn't leave it in your hand anymore. So that starts both a Confirm Hypothesis, going infinite with it, if you have Idyllic Pensive Songwriter Confirm Hypothesis, and it also stops Speak of the Iris, so you can no longer go Pensive Songwriter, What Looks Beyond, Speak of the Iris, cast the What Looks Beyond that you used to get the Speak of the Iris. So it stops a couple of different things there. 8-sack will probably live, Pensive Songwriter combo decks probably also live, though they're not like good combo decks. There's not really a ton of ways to abuse Songwriter now. Obviously still a very good card, but it is kind of more restricted to its vanilla purpose of getting multiple casts off a 2-drop or less spell, kind of like a proactive Cane Dance almost. There are a couple other changes as well, though much more minor in the grand scheme of things. Idyllic Odyssey no longer scries 3 on ETB, which for the few decks that played Idyllic Odyssey, I think basically only me. I think I'm the only person who actually was playing Idyllic Odyssey, so it really only affects me. But not scrying 3 means that you probably don't want to be playing it anymore. It used to be the best 1-mana 1 enchantment option for like Founding Hero, but not having any effect without Concord and needing to wait until your next upkeep is kind of a bit sketchy. And while the other options are not great, they're mainly not great because they're more gimmicky than Idyllic Odyssey was. But now Idyllic Odyssey is also pretty gimmicky without having that consistency from the Scry 3, so maybe it's better to move on to other effects. Warden of Time got changed very slightly, so it doesn't work with a random card from Karina's Explorations. Isochron Wand no longer abuses adventures quite as well. Cutting content now has a minor targeting update that matters sometime. So now moving on to the quest updates. Main card that we're seeing play that got changed is Seek the Lost Child, which now is not remotely as easy to trigger as it used to be, since previously you could go Seek the Lost Child fetch land. Now it triggers on attack, so you need at least 2 turns to trigger it, and the second mode is also changed to Scry 2, so not as powerful as getting a full extra card in the form of a 2 or less drop. It is kind of interesting because Seek the Lost Child does actually trigger itself, because you can play it, get a 0-1, attack on the next turn, Scry 2, play a 2-drop, then next turn you 2-drop attacks, or even just Seek the Lost Child attacks, but not the Seek, the Lost Child. And then you exile your Lost Child, get your 2 soldiers, and you're pretty happy. I'm inclined to still say that Seek the Lost Child is pretty playable. Obviously you're going to get the soldiers less, since the Lost Child is much more vulnerable than it used to be. But Scry 2 is still pretty good. It's still reasonably easy to trigger, and it's also just kind of an enchantment at 1 mana, which, particularly after the Idyllic Odyssey changes, is going to be attractive for some decks that want cheap enchantments, such as the new change Seek the Maker's Egg, which now only costs 3, gains life on the 1 and 2, and then reanimates a artifact or enchantment for the 3, which is just very efficient. 3 mana, reanimate a artifact or enchantment, does require some hoops to jump through, but it's probably worthwhile. Unconditional reanimation is always very powerful, even if there's not the best options for it. Inexorable Epidemic is probably the best, but you can just get back, get something more generic, Flourish into Flip Sands, or another Seek the Maker's Egg, and be probably pretty happy about that. Also gains you 6 life, which is really huge in these kind of more gimmicky decks. Gives you obviously a good burn matchup, probably a good aggro matchup too, depending on what else is in your deck. Maybe gives you some time to get to Inexorable Epidemic, whatever your big thing is. But I think in general it's just very efficient. You do need to be playing quite a few cheap artifacts and enchantments so that you can actually get the trigger going. If you really want to, you can play a bunch of realigns to get the reanimation immediately, though that's kind of gimmicky. You can also play stuff like Chiara if you want to go all in on reanimating enchantments specifically, though maybe there's not a ton of overlap there, depending on what you're trying to reanimate, since something like Head of Elko might also be a good target, as that's typically the Artificer's Gift target. One of the unfortunate hits out of the quest rework is Raid the Forgotten Tomb, which is now 2 mana, triggers on attack, only gets back creatures. Admittedly, Raid the Forgotten Tomb wasn't played a bunch, but in the decks that did see play in, it was always very important to them, particularly being a 1 mana mill for. So any decks that were playing it just for the mill, more so than the value, though the value is obviously important. Really don't like this card anymore, much more conditional, much harder to trigger. Though if you do have a 1-drop and you attack, you still get the mill 4 for 2 mana, though at 2 mana there's probably better options. There is a replacement though in another rework card with a Slave's Vengeance, which doesn't mill as much, only milling 1, but also gives you a 1/1 to attack with. But on top of that, the third mode, instead of getting any value, gets you interaction with a Exuent. So both players sacrifice a creature, which is pretty nasty. Something like be on the play, turn 1 1-drop, turn 2 Slave's Vengeance, attack, get the 1 and 2, so you get 2 1/1s, turn 3, or maybe even just on your opponent's turn 2, their play becomes very awkward since if they play a single creature, the Slave's Vengeance will blow up and kill it. So you do get kind of a tempo upside there. However, you are forced to get the abilities, though I guess you can just not attack, that's not great, so maybe it hits yourself. It does also have pretty nice upside in a late game, Monument being reduced to 4, and Crown of the Lurching King being a pretty scary card, counting all the cards in a graveyard is just a huge buff. Is pretty expensive, 4 to Monument and then 3 to equip, but Perform Ambition is a tremendously scary card, and even though Crown of the Lurching King only gets half of the Lurching King's power and toughness, so it only checks 1 graveyard, it's still huge, so probably worthwhile. There are a few other quest changes that are potentially interesting. Bind the Great Evil got changed to a creature ETB, which means that if you can get 3 creature ETBs on a single turn, you can proc it immediately, which makes it pretty tempting for some decks, since you can not only play it, exile an online permanent, but also pop it immediately. So it's basically just 1 mana, exile target online permanent. It does require a very specific deck, but honestly that might be worthwhile. Unlike before, where even with a fetch land, you couldn't pop it immediately, so you need not only a fetch land in hand, but also one in play. So it became a bit overly conditional. Maybe it's worthwhile now. There's a few other random changes, like Awaken the SOURCE, exiling the spells you cast instead of the spells from graveyard, trigger on cast now. So maybe that's easier to activate, since a 4-drop requiring more land drop was a bit tough. Now only requires spells cast. But overall, I think most of the quests, if you weren't playing them before, you probably aren't playing them now. And I believe that's the end of the changes. There's a couple of other minor ones that don't really impact much. Selvar, the Seeker, got changed to being a scout, if that matters for anything. The red-white version of that same cycle as Selvar got changed to being a warrior, if I'm remembering correctly. Yeah, Vosh the champion got changed to being warrior, which maybe matters if you're playing warrior tribal, but overall nothing particularly impactful for any other decks.